In Lesson 8.2, we're going to discuss how we can use z-scores to compare athletes. Comparing athletes from team to team within a season or from year to year is relatively easy. For example, if we were to compare two different players from the 2016 season who happened to play on different teams, for example, Ezekiel Elliott from the Dallas Cowboys and Jordan Howard from the Chicago Bears, we could very easily compare their rushing yards from that year because they're playing in the same year against the same competition and so on. However, it becomes a little more difficult when we want to compare somebody who was playing in the 2016 season to somebody like Jim Brown, however, who rushed for 1,257 yards back in 1960. Now, even though this 1,257 yards is below the rushing accomplishments of Ezekiel Elliott or Jordan Howard, football 50 years ago was quite a different game. And so, what we need to do is use standardized scores to compare these athletes because they're essentially playing in different eras when the sport was different. We're going to do an example like this using baseball. The single season home run record for Major League Baseball the home run record rather has improved just 3 times since Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs in 1927, which at that point was a record. Roger Maris hit 61 home runs in 1961. Mark McGwire then broke the record again in 1998 by hitting 70 home runs, and Barry Bonds hit 73 home runs in 2001. In an absolute sense, Barry Bonds has the best performance of these four because he had the most home runs in a season with 73. However, some people speculate that it may have been easier for him to hit home runs because of other factors like the quality of pitchers, the hardness of the baseballs, dimensions of the ballpark, and of course, we know that there was quite a bit of scandal around that time with baseball players using performance enhancing drugs. So, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at these four performances and we're going to standardize them all. Standardize means we're going to calculate a z-score for each hitter. And what you have been given in your notes is the mean number of home runs and the standard deviation for home runs for all the hitters in those years when those initial records were set. So, for Babe Ruth, for example, we can calculate his z-score. Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs, and the average that year was 7.2 home runs. So we take his performance minus the average, and we divide that by the standard deviation of 9.7, and that gives him a z-score of 5.44. Remember, that means that his performance was 5.44 standard deviations above the mean. Now we can repeat that for the other baseball players that have set records. And what I would encourage you to do at this point is to pause the video and then do those calculations and then restart it and make sure that you calculated them correctly. So for Roger Maris, he hit 61 home runs. The average that year was 18.8 and the standard deviation was 13.4. That gives him a z-score of 3.15. For Mark McGwire, he hit 70 home runs, but the average that year was 20.7 and the standard deviation was 12.7. So his z-score is 3.88. And for Barry Bonds, who has the current home run record, he hit 73, but the average that year was 21.4 and the standard deviation was 13.2, leaving him with a z-score of 3.91. So even though these are all record-setting performances and all clearly above the mean for that year, Babe Ruth still would be considered the best home run hitter because his performance is more standard deviations above the mean than anyone else's. Or now we're going to go back and revisit fantasy baseball leagues. And we talked in the previous section about how when people draft fantasy leagues, they look at lots of different variables. And so if we want to properly estimate the fantasy value of a particular player, we have to measure each player's performance in several different categories and then combine them. And because all these variables are measured on a different scale, the only way to really do this is to use standardized scores. So we have given here the mean and standard deviations for each of the 5 variables used in fantasy baseball for the 2009 season. So we have batting average, home runs, runs batted in, stolen bases, and runs. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at our 2 baseball players from the last section, Ichiro and Dunn, and we're going to calculate their z-score for each of these variables. And again, I'll show you the first couple of calculations, and then I would recommend that you maybe pause the video and try some of them on your own. So for the first one we're going to look at is batting average. And when we go back and we look at batting average for the 2009 season, the mean batting average is 0.270 and the standard deviation is 0.029. So we can calculate a z-score for Ichiro using those numbers that were given in your notes. So I'll show you one calculation over to the side here. So we would do z equals Ichiro's batting average is 3.5 or 0.352. We would subtract the mean batting average for that year, which was 0.270. And sorry, this is pretty hard to read. And then we're going to divide that by the standard deviation of batting averages, which is 0.029. And that was how I got that calculation of 0.283. Now for done, we're going to repeat that, but we're going to replace the 0.352 with his batting average, which is 0.267. Now notice that his batting average is below the mean. And when we calculate his z-score, it works out to be a negative number. So if we were making our selection for our fantasy league based solely on batting average, we would obviously pick Ichiro because he's way above the mean, and Dunn is actually below the mean. Now we're going to repeat that for all the other variables. So for home runs, we would use a mean of 15.3 and a standard deviation of 9.9. That gives Ichiro home run z-score of negative 0.43. Dunn is 2.29. Notice he's way above the league average in home runs. So he has a positive z-score while Ichiro's is negative. I'll do the same thing for runs batted in. Here the mean is 62.6, standard deviation is 25. In this category, Dunn outperformed Ichiro. Now, stolen bases, the mean is 8.8, standard deviation is 10.7. Notice that Ichiro was way above that mean of 8 stolen bases, so he finished with a positive z-score. Dunn didn't have any stolen bases, so since he was below the mean, he finishes with a negative z-score of 0.82. Last but not least, we have runs, and Ichiro finished with a z-score of 1.04. Here we're using a mean of 65.1 and a standard deviation of 22. Dunn was also above the mean, but not quite as much for this category. Now, for their overall value, we would just add up all those z-scores, including the negatives. So Ichiro's overall value, 4.39, Dunn's 3.79. So if you were going to pick one of these two players to draft, you would probably select Ichiro. Please do homework 8.2 in your assignment packet.